Buenas tardes, bienvenidos al Seminario Anual del Consejo Minero, que como prácticamente todos los eventos se realiza de manera virtual en este año. Sin duda, el año 2020 será recordado a nivel global como un año complejo, marcado por una grave crisis sanitaria y económica derivada de la pandemia originada por el COVID-19. Chile, como es obvio, no ha sido inmune a este fenómeno, el cual se ha sumado una crisis social y política que ha dado paso a un proceso constituyente. Para algunos, fuente de graves incertidumbres, para otros, de esperanza y oportunidades. En este contexto, la minería chilena, en líneas generales, ha tenido un buen desempeño y espera seguir teniéndolo. Lo anterior, fruto de múltiples factores que propongo revisar en estas breves palabras de balance anual y proyección para el año que recién comienza y que he dividido en tres partes: pandemia y continuidad operacional, mercados y proyecciones, y minería y proceso constituyente. Pandemia y continuidad operacional. Las compañías mineras de mayor tamaño del país y que forman parte del Consejo Minero tuvieron desde los orígenes de la pandemia en Chile la voluntad de continuar operando, no obstante la extendida paralización de actividades económicas que afectaba al país. La condición que se autoimpusieron para ello fue que no se incrementara la tasa de contagio de sus trabajadores y de las localidades del entorno a las faenas. Para lograr lo anterior, por una parte, las compañías mineras suspendieron la mayoría de los proyectos que estaban en construcción, toda vez que la densidad dotacional no permitía cumplir con los estrictos protocolos sanitarios que se autoimpusieron para evitar los contagios. Por otra, con relación a las faenas que estaban operando, desde marzo se tomaron múltiples medidas, tales como pasar al sistema de teletrabajo todas las funciones que eran susceptibles de realizarse bajo esa modalidad, disminuir dotaciones en faenas entre un 30 y un 40%, privilegiando a los trabajadores locales y enviando a sus hogares a todos quienes constituyeran grupo de riesgo, ajustando en algunos casos sistemas de turnos de 7x7 a 14x14 días, aplicando controles preventivos previos al ingreso a la faena con aplicación de test rápidos de anticuerpos y test PCR, habilitando residencias sanitarias, aplicando protocolos de distanciamiento en transporte y lugares comunes en faena, entregando elementos de protección personal como mascarillas, alcohol gel, guantes, etc. El éxito en la aplicación de las medidas antes referidas se explica por la profunda cultura de seguridad que existe en el sector minero, la que posibilitó una rápida implementación de protocolos sanitarios propios de la pandemia. Además, hubo un activo y generoso trabajo sectorial destinado a compartir buenas prácticas, aciertos y desaciertos, en un camino en que nada estaba escrito y que se materializó en un grupo de trabajo permanente de los especialistas en salud de las compañías mineras bajo el alero del Consejo. También destacamos el decidido compromiso y esfuerzo de los trabajadores que supieron, con flexibilidad, asumir este nuevo escenario. Asimismo, y no menos importante, valoramos la coordinación permanente con las autoridades locales y nacionales. Cada compañía ha mantenido un estrecho contacto con alcaldes, seremis, intendentes de sus respectivas comunas y regiones, y a nivel nacional, a través del Consejo Minero, con los ministerios de Minería, Salud, Trabajo, Economía e Interior. Al nivel nacional, el sector no dudó en sumarse al fondo siempre convocado por la Confederación de la Producción y el Comercio, al cual aportó más de 50.000 millones de pesos, y a nivel local se han realizado múltiples ayudas. Todo lo anterior se ha traducido, entre otras muchas cosas, en 50 ventiladores mecánicos y 200 cánulas de oxigenación para hospitales de las regiones mineras, equipos de protección personal para el servicio de salud público, equipamiento de red de laboratorios, equipamiento de hospitales de campaña y fondos de ayuda para pequeñas y medianas empresas proveedoras del sector. Estamos conscientes que queda un largo camino por recorrer y que no obstante la llegada de la vacuna a Chile, lo cual celebramos y reconocemos como un hito relevante en la gestión de la pandemia por parte del gobierno, el desafío de continuar operando y colaborando con el país demanda disciplina en el autocuidado, estricto cumplimiento de protocolos y mucho, pero mucho trabajo colaborativo entre las empresas y el sector público, claves del buen desempeño de la minería durante el año que recién termina. La segunda parte de mis palabras se denomina mercado y proyecciones. El año 2020 terminó con un precio promedio del cobre de $2,8 la libra. Este valor no es distinto del observado en los 3 años anteriores y por lo tanto en principio no llama mucho la atención. Sin embargo, su fluctuación durante el año pasado fue importante, principalmente asociada a la pandemia. Comenzó el año en el valor tendencial de $2,8, pero a medida que se conocía el avance de los contagios a nivel mundial, su precio cayó hasta $2,2. Si no cayó más es porque a las malas perspectivas para la demanda se añadieron las restricciones a la producción de cobre que afectaron a diversos países. De ahí en adelante el precio repuntó suave pero sostenidamente, sobre todo motivado por la demanda de China que compensaba con creces el ambiente recesivo del resto del mundo. Así llegamos a diciembre, con precios diarios de hasta $3,6 y mejores perspectivas globales gracias al inicio de la vacunación contra el coronavirus. Si bien el cobre es nuestro principal producto, el Consejo Minero también tiene como socios a empresas de gran minería del oro y del hierro, cuyos precios tuvieron alzas interesantes durante el año 2020. Los valores de $1.770 la onza de oro y de $107 la tonelada de hierro representaron aumentos del 30 y 12% respectivamente en comparación con el año 2019. Desde la producción podemos decir que en Chile el cobre mostró una resiliencia destacable en el año de la pandemia. Logramos terminar en un nivel muy similar al del 2019 de 5,8 millones de toneladas. Más allá de la coyuntura, el catastro de proyectos de inversión sigue mostrando un potencial interesante para la minería chilena. Proyectos en ejecución por $24.000 millones y en evaluación por $37.000 millones para esta década así lo confirman. De la concreción o no de esos proyectos depende que la producción de cobre pueda superar los 8 millones de toneladas anuales o quedarnos estancados en las cerca de 6 millones que hemos producido actualmente. Finalmente, me quisiera referir al proceso constituyente y al rol que la minería podría o debería jugar en ese proceso. Recordemos en primer lugar que la minería aporta al país la mitad de sus exportaciones y un cuarto de sus inversiones, así como un décimo tanto del Producto Interno Bruto como del empleo directo e indirecto. Para mantener en el tiempo estas valiosas contribuciones son fundamentales los principios y normas que establezca la Constitución. Por esto el sector bajo el alero del Consejo Minero participará activamente en la discusión de nuestra nueva Constitución. Abordaremos esta participación con una actitud abierta, constructiva, optimista, buscando soluciones realistas a los diversos desafíos que esta nueva etapa significará para el país y para la minería. El interés sectorial, como es evidente, no se agota en las materias mineras. Habrá regulaciones constitucionales de temas como recursos hídricos, protección del medio ambiente, tributos y trabajo que nos resultan de sumo interés y en cuya discusión también tenemos la firme voluntad de participar. Asimismo, lo haremos en algunos temas políticos sociales, cuya realidad es especialmente cercana para la minería, como la descentralización y el fortalecimiento de las regiones, el desarrollo sostenible y los pueblos indígenas. El desarrollo minero chileno ha sido, sin duda alguna, exitoso. Estamos seguros que la regulación sectorial ha sido un pilar fundamental en esto. Por sus altas inversiones, los extensos plazos, los inciertos resultados, los negocios mineros requieren de un marco jurídico estable y cierto. Esto, así como el necesario respeto de los acuerdos internacionales, hacen esperable y aconsejable un importante grado de continuidad en los ejes y bajadas de la normativa minera. Estimamos necesario que la nueva Constitución contenga normas que regulen suficientemente los fundamentos del desarrollo minero, como permitir que las sustancias mineras sean objeto de concesiones de exploración y de explotación, otorgando a los particulares las necesarias certezas jurídicas y extensión en el tiempo que justifiquen la realización de cuantiosas inversiones que a veces no resultan rentables. Parece esencial la mantención de nuestro exitoso sistema mixto que combina armoniosamente la minería pública con la privada, de capitales nacionales y extranjeros, así como las operaciones de pequeño, mediano y gran tamaño. Sin duda, un proceso constituyente es fuente de incertidumbre. Todo cambio lo es, y el de la constitución de un país en especial. Pero también es fuente de esperanza y oportunidades para construir un mejor Chile. Desde la minería creemos que todos los chilenos, deberíamos aproximarnos a este proceso y participar en él con ánimo constructivo, de buena fe y con espíritu generoso. A eso nos comprometemos, a eso los invitamos. Muchas gracias.
Hello, everybody, and thank you very much for the invitation to address you today. I must say I had been looking forward very much to visit again your wonderful country, but here we are. But nonetheless, I've been looking forward to talking today about sustainability, which I understand that you discussed quite a bit in Chile, and I'll try to provide an international, European, and particularly maybe a perspective seen from the Nordic countries. One could have thought that the coronavirus would have killed the climate debate. However, that is not the case. It is still very much alive in most regions of the world, and that's very good. Actually, I think that in an odd way, the COVID-19 crisis have sort of made it very clear to all of us that we can change. Change is possible, even change of behavior. We have also seen how costly it is to ignore the warnings of science. And then we have also seen that it pays off to show leadership, be it in business, in a company, or in a city, or in a nation. Leadership pays off. I would very much hope that these kind of lessons learned could be brought into the situation that we face now, where climate change, for instance, is as urgent to address as ever. And yes, I know, of course, very well that some people would say, yes, but didn't emissions drop during the COVID-19 crisis and the pandemic? Yes, of course it did. But it is not such a big deal to be able to lower emissions when we close down our societies. The whole trick is, how do we move towards a low emission, a zero emission society that is not closed down? That this challenge is as urgent as ever. I would like to start this by just showing a very short movie to you. It comes here. And as you saw, it started in 1880. And what you see is the temperatures as they have been measured on a numerous number of weather stations, meteorological stations around the planet, where it is blue and white, it's getting colder, and where it's gold and orange and red, it is getting hotter. And as you can see, it's quite a boring movie. Sometimes it gets cold, sometimes it gets warm, but then try and have a look of what is happening over the last decades and what is that really disturbs the scientists. You can see here, this movie will stop 2019. We have recently, actually last week, got the numbers also for 2020, which parallels 2016 being the warmest year ever on record, globally speaking. I start showing you this movie because it shows the acceleration of the change that we have to address. And I know that when some people see this, they would say, yes, but then we must stop growth. No, because while we still have this movie accelerating, or this reality accelerating, we also have more and more people on planet Earth. Meaning that whether we like it or not, in the decades to come, we will have a lot of growth, more growth than ever. And the big issue is not whether to have growth or not, we will get growth, but that is how to make that growth sustainable. We will still need minerals, extraction, production, materials, resources, food, heating, energy, what have we. Actually, that was what the Paris Agreement and the agreement with the 17 Sustainable Development Goals were all about. How can we create a smarter, a more intelligent, a more sustainable kind of growth? We must get away from the silos. We must integrate sustainability in everything we do, in all sorts of investments and activities and decision-making. And it's not just for the rich part of the world, not just for the OECD countries, it's for everybody to pursue a more sustainable growth model. We must get more out of less. You could think, yeah, sounds nice, who would be against this? But is it feasible? Is it possible? And that's where it could be relevant to give a few examples to you from the Nordic areas. But sort of zoom in on Norway, Sweden and Denmark, together 20+ million citizens. How come that we tend to believe that we are among the most sort of sustainable societies in the world? Well, if you take all the rankings from UN agencies, from World Economic Forum, from the OECD, you would often find the Nordic countries, or almost always find the Nordic countries in sort of the top 5, 6, 7, be it on social cohesion, on employment, on welfare, on innovation capacity, on competitiveness, and on environment and climate. Even when it comes to the Global Happiness Index, normally there is a sound competition between Norway and Denmark as to who should be number 1 and who should be number 2. We have had a strong focus on social justice, social equality. That has been sort of the core of the self-identity in the Nordic countries, and that has been there for more than 100 years. I would say that since the 1970s, also environment has come very, very strong into the picture as sort of a profound value, a profound part of our identity. Today, Denmark and Sweden would be among the countries in the world who have set the most ambitious climate targets. Denmark has a target of reducing emissions by 70% by 2030, and Sweden 65% also by 2030. That has also come due to a continued push from sort of the bottom up, from the citizens, from civil society. And it's typically in the Nordic countries that we do not have sort of green parties in per se. It is more the tradition that the sustainability agenda is woven into the programs of all the parties, most of the parties at least, be they right, left or center. And today I would say that this green transition is accepted very, very broadly. I think it has something to do with our political tradition. We have a tradition of minority governments where you really have to cooperate and find and seek compromises and solutions. And that means that there is a certain continuity. When first we have agreed on a direction, a path to take, then there is a certain sort of cooperative spirit around it and a certain continuity and not so much stop-go. But I think that another part of the Nordic secret is sort of our tradition for tripartite cooperation. Meaning this is not just a question of how to work politically. There is a tradition of including the employers' associations and the trade unions. I have seen in the Chilean NDC from last spring that there was also a very clear invitation to have public-private roundtable dialogues. And I think that is also what we have traditionally done in the Nordics. Take, for instance, in Norway, back in 2016, I was involved in a work up there where the Norwegian Prime Minister said, in a low-carbon world, in Norway, we can not only live from oil and gas, which is their primary industry today, so what should we live from? And as part of that work, 17 different sectors came up with each their roadmap towards 2050. What would it look like in their sector should they be low carbon, zero emitting? Sweden was inspired by the same example and initiated a similar process. And last year in Denmark, we had 13 climate partnerships established, where all the key stakeholders from each sector, the building sector, the production sector, the energy sector, agriculture, what have you, 13 different climate partnerships came up with their respective bits as to how could they move into a zero emission world. Where were the barriers that would have to be removed? Where was there things that the policymakers would have to do? What could they themselves do? Where would there be scientific gaps or knowledge gaps or technology gaps that had to be addressed, and so on and so forth? That meant that the government and the parties in parliament, they got a huge pool of proposals from business that they could sort of be inspired from. Meaning that instead of business just sitting there waiting idle for whatever the government would feel like regulating, they came with their solid negotiated sort of proposals. And I can say that to many of the sectors, it was actually for the first time that all the stakeholders sat around the same table and identified what to do with this challenge. I think that so far it has proven to be a very, very successful process. Both in the Nordic countries and in EU, there is a long tradition of setting up targets, preferably binding targets. Where do we want to be? When? That is a very strong political tool. Targets for CO2 reductions, targets for energy efficiency, targets for renewables, and how do you follow up on that? At the same time, we also have a strong tradition of pricing what we do not want. Pricing pollution, pricing CO2, making a strong incentive to do what we want more of and to punish what we want less of. You could argue that it's a market failure in a capitalist system when it pays off to pollute or to waste resources or to emit emissions. So particularly in the Nordics, we have a really long tradition, I think some of the citizens would say a very, very long tradition of taxing things where we want to change behavior. And actually in the Nordic countries, we had CO2 pricing in our energy system even before EU introduced that. I can tell you that as late as early here in January, the Norwegian Conservative Prime Minister presented a proposal according to which to emit 1 ton of CO2 should by the end of this decade cost what adequates $250 per ton. That is really substantial. That came from a conservative prime minister, by the way, in a year where Norway is going for elections. So that just shows that nobody would propose that if there was not sort of a general recognition in society that this is needed. Also in Denmark, when the government and the parliament agreed this target of reducing emissions by 70%, the Confederation of Danish Industries came out very early supporting this extremely ambitious targets. How come? Because they have seen that what we have done up till now has been a driver for job creation. Actually, in Denmark, a country with 5.5 million inhabitants, the green sector in the last few decades have managed to create 60,000 industrial jobs, blue-collar jobs. And that is quite substantial. You cannot point to many other sectors that would be capable of having done that. Also, it's very interesting that, for instance, we are very strong in wind energy. 30 years ago, we did not have any wind turbines. Today, it's a huge export area. Green technologies will be around 10% of all our combined export. And the interesting thing is that most of the jobs that have been created, not just with the big companies, but also with the subcontractors, It is out in rural areas, in areas where else there has not been so much industrial development. So I think that's also one of the reasons why there is a broad support also among Danish business people that this is the right way to do. It's a driver for innovation, it is a driver for research and development, and it is a driver for a modern industry policy. You could say the same, that's the same argument that now goes for Europe. You've probably heard about the European Green Deal that has been presented and now also adopted by all 27 EU member states, where one of the key points is that Europe should reduce its emissions by at least 55% by the end of this decade, by 2030. And here in the aftermath of the COVID-19 crisis and the economic consequences following that, we have seen a recovery package in the EU of 900 billion US dollars, 900 billion US dollars, where 1/3 of that amount has been earmarked for the green transition, and there has been adopted a requirement for the remaining 2/3 of that money that it must not do any harm to the chances for us reaching our climate targets. So 1/3 directly for that, 2/3 must not do any harm. That's a rather strong new principle. And when Europe dares to do that, it's because, for instance, during the financial crisis, we saw that the green agenda was a driver for job creation. For instance, renovating buildings, for instance, energy efficiency and resource efficiency turn out to be one of the big job creators. Waste handling, energy efficiency, renovating of housing, that is among the most labor-intensive sectors, and it is the kind of jobs, it's creating the kind of jobs that cannot easily be outsourced to other regions, to China or wherever the jobs could go. Recently in Denmark, in the light of the COVID-19 crisis, for instance, we set aside what is equivalent to 5 billion US dollars for renovating our social housing. It creates jobs, it diminishes energy poverty, it benefits people living in these social housing, so what's not to like? That's a kind of sort of integrated approach that is being more and more widespread. Besides the targets and the price signal in Europe and in the Nordics, we also very much use the tool of standards. And I know that that is also a discussion in Chile. How far can you go with standards? I must say that in European policies, it's probably one of our most efficient tools. When you set up standards for buildings, for machinery, for fuel, for chemicals, whatever, it actually works. And it makes it possible to be front runners, that some companies can be front runners because the rest will sort of have to follow suit within a certain time frame. Take an example as cars. Now, I know that your sector is mining and extraction. That is not so big in Europe. But in Europe, car manufacturing is huge. It is said that in our biggest economy in Germany, it's between 5 to 10% of all jobs that somehow is related to the car industry. How to handle a transition in such a huge industry? Well, what has been done is to set up standards that forces the industry to innovate faster and to go towards electrification. Because if they don't, there is a really, really hard enforcement where they will be fined if they don't live up to the standards set for a certain year. So that means that now electrification of the cars manufacturing industry has really taken up. I met recently with the CEO of Porsche, you know, the sports car. And he told me that by 2030, their expectation is that 70% of all Porsche's vehicles will be electric. I mean, if I had said things like that only 5 years ago, people would have said, dream on, but the transition is happening right now. In Norway, they have actually said that from 2025, It should not be possible to buy a new car that is a combustion engine. The acceleration is rather visibly, the transition is happening. Of course, there is the fear. Would that mean job losses? It's fine with all these green people talking about job creation, but it's in reality not job losses. For instance, electric vehicles, they are much more simple, fewer components and things like that than the combustion engine. So would jobs not be lost? A new big study from Fraunhofer Institute, a very well-respected university, on behalf of Volkswagen, or they did it for Volkswagen money, but it was independent, said, no, you don't have to lose the jobs because there are new options and possibilities in battery cells development, in digitization, and in upskilling and reskilling. Upskilling and reskilling, it's key here for the transition. So now it is generally accepted that in the new industry policy of Europe and the job creation focus that is needed in light of COVID-19, we really need to sort of move forward on the green agenda. And we have to look through the whole innovation chain, the value chain there, with private companies, public funding, and the traditional universities. And the interesting thing is that so far it seems that the transformation is very broadly accepted by our citizens. Now, let me turn to the issue of constitutions, because I know that that is a very hot topic in Chile, and I know you have initiated this process, and there is a discussion. Would it help you to achieve the different sustainability goals if it is written into the constitution? I'm not to judge for that, but I can say how the Nordics have handled this. Actually, we have handled it very, very differently. For instance, Finland since year 2000 had sustainability written into their constitution. In 2011, Sweden revised their constitution, and there, for instance, they wrote that the public institutions shall promote sustainable development leading to a good environment for present and future generations. That is now in their constitution. In Norway, they did something similar some years later, 2016, where they say all individuals have the right to a healthy environment where productive capacity and diversity are preserved. And again, they mentioned the long-term and future generations. But in my country, in Denmark, there is not one word on sustainability or environment or whatever in our constitution that dates back to 1849, and it was last revised back in 1953. So how do we do it? Well, instead we have a binding climate law that is supported by almost all parties, with 95% of the members of the parliament is behind this law with binding targets. So what is best? Well, it's hard to tell. I know that, for instance, the green organization Greenpeace some years back sued Norway for extracting up north, which Greenpeace said that is against the words in the constitution. But here, just before Christmas, the Norwegian Supreme Court rejected that sue, so nothing came out of that. It's hard to tell what's best, because when in a constitution you write about sustainability, it's good, it can be a strong tool for citizens and civil society, and it can oblige policymakers to take sustainability into consideration, also in times where they tend to maybe forget about it. But what does it really mean, sustainability? How to interpret that? So my point is that whether you have it in or not, and it could be a good idea to have it in, but that is not enough, because it is not in itself a guarantee for action. I believe that the most important thing is to have agreed targets, preferably across sort of party lines, broadly anchored in society, very solid implementation plans. And then I actually think that to work with a triple bottom line, a social, an economic, an environmental bottom line, when you measure what growth is, that is probably one of the best and most strong tools. I think that that goes whether you are a nation, a community, a city, or a company. If you work with triple bottom lines, you will already have come some way. Summing up, I think that we have to redefine our understanding of what is growth in the 21st century. How to make that growth a sustainable growth. I think that we are on the path to a new paradigm where we have to say goodbye to the old sort of silo thinking. We have to have a much more cross-cutting way of cutting through the complexity. It also means that we have to work together in new manners, and we have to have public-private partnerships. I think that is absolutely key. I also think that we have to move to a more circular economy instead of the old linear way of producing and use and throw out. We have to reuse, use up, recycle, and minimize waste. And then I think that we should harvest the benefits and the potential in digitalization, digital solutions, and then I think that we are moving towards an electrification in society. I think that this new paradigm, that will really spread into global value change. Now we have a new administration coming in the US. We have seen the President Biden sort of announce that he will sort of work according to a Build Back Better theory, and energy, climate, environment, sustainability is at the core of the strategy of the new administration. And already now the EU Commission has invited the US to sort of establish a transatlantic partnership, for instance, on green trade and things like that. So I think it is coming, and I think it's coming pretty rapidly now, also because China also wants to move in some of these areas. So I think that the implications will be felt for everybody who is working with the global markets. I also do think that values are changing, not the least among a younger generation. And they expect that we work sustainably, that we act and plan and take decisions with regard to sustainability. And I really think that that is the new license to operate. There is a reputational risk if we don't do that. To stay put, to continue business as usual, just hoping that this trend will wane away, or maybe we will be preoccupied with something else, I don't think that's going to happen. Also because the movie that I showed you in the beginning, climate change is really accelerating, and the resource consumption, the number of people on planet Earth makes it mandatory for us to try and find a smarter way to grow. So I think it's on the opposite. I think this trend will only be accelerating, and I think that everyone who believes in a social market economy needs now to show that the system is capable of handling this huge, huge challenge. So I think, in conclusion, that the sooner a nation, a company, a sector understand this, the better for the competitiveness, because in the decades to come, I'm absolutely convinced that sustainability and economic well-being and competitiveness will not be seen as separate things. It has to go hand in hand, and those who understand that best first, they will also be the most competitive in this 21st century. Thank you very much.
We thank Connie for her interesting presentation, in which we learn about the international experience on environmental institution, legislation, and current challenges in this area. Without a doubt, her words will be very helpful in this challenging process, where we will define the framework that Chile needs to tackle the challenges of the 21st century. Now, I will introduce the participants of our discussion panel. Connie, again,
Connie Hedegaard is a Danish politician, president of the OECD's Roundtable for Sustainability. She was the European Commissioner for Climate Action during the Barroso II Commission and former Minister of Environment, Climate and Energy of Denmark. She will be in the panel conversation with Tom Butler. Hi, Tom. Nice to see you again. Thank you for joining us. Tom has been CEO of the ICMM since July 2015. Before that, he spent 18 years with the International Finance Corporation, part of the World Bank Group, in the Infrastructure and Natural Resources team. Focuses mainly on mining and power projects in Africa. From 2011, Tom was IFC's global head of mining, where he led a multidisciplinary team of specialists responsible for IFC's financing of mining exploration and development in emerging market economies. Thank you, both of you, for being with us today. And let's go for the first question. Let's begin with Connie. Connie, from your point of view, which are the big environmental discussions that are taking place in Europe today, in addition to climate change, or climate change is all at this time?
Yeah, in a way you could say this, but of course we still focus very much also on, say, for instance, oceans, water. Water is a huge issue, particularly in Southern Europe, desalination of water, how to handle the changing water pattern. That is, for instance, one big thing. Biodiversity is a huge challenge, how to cope with that. And that is an area where there are not too many good results, actually. So I would say that is some of the things. But again, air pollution is also very, very much a big issue, particularly in parts of Europe. But there you can also see some of the co-benefits between sort of the Green Deal, the green transition, climate and environment. It goes together because, for instance, take a country like Poland, which is very dependent on coal, but they also have a number of the most polluted cities, air quality-wise, in Europe. So to modernize their energy systems would also improve air quality, and that would again also improve health for their citizens. So that's sort of an example of how environment, climate, energy, social well-being plays together.
During your presentation, you talk about targets, pricing, and standards. Does the European community has the same standards, pricing systems, and targets, or each country that is member of the European community has its own standard pricing and target system?
No, actually, because among the 27 countries in Europe, we have what we call a single market. You should be able to freely exchange goods. And if you want to have sort of an open market, then you cannot compete on the lowest possible common denominator when it comes to environment standards, for instance. So that is why since 20, 30 years, you have seen more and more standards in the environmental field, for instance. Take an example. We have a lot of farmers in Europe, of course. They get some subsidies from the common EU budget, but in order to get the subsidies, they also have to live up to certain criteria, certain standards. And the trick is normally to give quite a long warning, 5 years, 8 years, 10 years before a standard comes into force with full force, but that what I have to live up to 6, 8, 10 years down the line. So we have that in chemicals, we have that for machinery, we have that for, really many things where there are joint standards. And sometimes people could say, yes, but is that not bureaucratic? Is that not red tape? Is that not costly? But it often turns out that who comes and asks for more standards? Often it's actually the industry, because it's easier for industry to work with one standard to 27 markets instead of with 27 different standards. That does not mean we are not fighting over sort of how ambitious should the standards be, but still the idea to have common standards That is a very much inbuilt part of the common single market.
I hope. Thank you, Connie. Tom, from the role at the ICMM, which gathers the large mining companies that operate globally, what are the main environmental advances that mining has made in the last 10 or 20 years?
Thanks, Joaquin, and thank you very much for the invitation and the opportunity to participate in this discussion. And Connie and I haven't rehearsed this, but I would actually agree with the three topics that she mentioned. So first of all, I think on water, which I think is obviously particularly relevant in Chile, but in very many other countries, I think we've made great progress. We started off 20 years ago with the perception that water was a resource where you just needed to secure rights and access to it, to considering it to be a finite shared resource where all sorts of other users are competing for the resource and nature as well. And we've made a lot of progress in how we think about that today. We have a holistic approach. We have a commitment to consider water use on a catchment basis, which means considering the impacts on all other users within the catchment when you're planning a new project. And there's been some great examples of member collaboration around the world in water scarce regions like Chile, Peru, and South Africa with communities and with other users. So I think that's one area. The second area is biodiversity. I think 20 years ago, if you sort of call it flora and fauna, it was seen as collateral damage in the mining process. There was very little attempt at stewardship. And today, we show a lot more respect. One of the longest commitments that ICMM members made about 17 years ago now was to not explore or mine in protected areas, World Heritage Sites. And more recently, we've made commitments to implement the mitigation hierarchy, which is essentially, first of all, to avoid if possible, then to minimize, then to restore, and then to offset. And then last but not least, climate change. We've moved from a position of inaction to reaction to being more proactive and strategic in terms of what we can do about contributing to the effort to reduce emissions. And there's some concrete examples of this, but they're also, from the policy perspective, starting off in about, I think, 2008, 2009, the members articulated a position statement on climate change, which included a very clear recognition that the ultimate solution would lie in the implementation of an effective carbon pricing policy. And so at the time, that was a big step, I think, for the members, but now it seems like sort of bread and butter. But it is interesting. Connie mentioned carbon pricing in her talk, and that the Norwegians are talking about potentially $250 a ton. One of my team went to visit a copper mine in the far north in Sweden, where it's extremely low grade, would probably not be mined in Chile because it would be considered too low grade. And they're already paying a carbon price of something like 130 euros a ton, and they're profitable. So, her point about people being competitive by setting the pace, actually, this is a proof point. And there are other examples, as you know well, in Chile, a number of companies, including 7 of our members, have committed to completely renewable power purchase agreements, and some of them are already, put those contracts into place. And, companies are also starting to focus on their scope 3 emissions, which of course is the elephant in the room for the mining sector, because scope 1 and 2 is only about 6 or 7% of the total. We've got people like BHP committing to spend 400 million with downstream users to see how they can collaborate to find alternative technologies.
Tom, in general terms, global mining companies are sharing the targets. Are they having the same targets or similar targets and standards in the fields that you talk about?
So we haven't seen completely consistent approach to targets. I think it's very case by case, depending on the commodity that you're in, the countries that you're operating in, and also how far up the curve you are. But we have seen in the last year a number of announcements by our members, with generally setting targets for net zero by 2040, 2050. Some of them setting targets for net zero on scope 1 and 2, and one of them very ambitiously setting a carbon neutral target for 2050 on scope 1, 2, and 3. So basically, that would require a lot of engagement with their end users, their downstream value chain. But the ambitions are being put on the table now.
Thank you, Tom. Connie, you have said during your presentation that the constitutional answer for the environmental challenges is quite different. It depends on the country. In some cases, you have important rules on the constitution. In other ones, you have none, or just small ones. From this point of view, what is more important at the end? What kind of institutional framework do you have? What kind of institutions you have that made that all these kind of rules can be really enforced? What are the kind of environmental agencies that you have, the ministers that you have? Which is the way that they are well coordinated? If this is a policy that in a certain way applies in all the fields of the economy, which is the way that, if it's not as the constitution, which is the way that you can assure that all of the fields of the economy that will fulfill the requirements of these new environmental rules or requirements?
Yeah, just to be sure, I hope I said that I think there are many good things to be said about having it into a constitution. I mean, if you're modernizing your constitution anyhow, it makes sense in the 21st century. It's just not a guarantee for a lot of action, so it cannot stand alone. What we have with our big climate, with the climate law, with binding targets, said this is the minus 70% by 2030. That is now set into a law with almost all parties, right, center, and left, sort of together saying this. So even if the government changed, they would still have to live up to the same criteria, the same standards, the same targets. And in that law, it also says that there is a National Climate Council, and they have been given rather a strong role there. If, for instance, the country is not on track the policies are not on track to meet the targets, then they have been given certain authority to go in and advise Parliament. But I mean, it will be a very, very public thing then that we are not on track, and then the government, through that climate law, is obliged to come up with new initiatives that can prove that it is likely that we will reach the target. So it's quite a novelty, but it's rather strong. And this Climate Council has a stronger role than we have normally seen. Having said that, then you should also be mindful of the fact that we have EU also setting its targets, dividing it into targets for each country. So there you are also obliged to somehow live up to whatever you have adopted in the EU. So there are numerous layers, but of course it's hard to put anybody in jail if they are not living up to such a target. But I think that the new thing is that all ministries and all sectors, through this process with the climate law, starts to become much more serious about these things. And maybe it could be interesting for you to know that the finance ministry, that I think we have seen that in many countries, normally have been quite reluctant to sort of work with these three triple bottom line and things like that, GDP plus, what have you. They have now started to sort of look at all their modeling to see whether the models they normally use, whether they are fit for purpose when it comes to the sustainability challenges for the 21st century. So the whole system is gradually starting to realize that they have to change the usual mindset.
So it seems that the environment issues and the climate change or global warming challenges is not an isolated issue. It's something that is along all the policies of the government and on all the policies of the state. At the end, it's a general issue, no, it's a particular one. It's
starting to get more integrated.
Okay.
I would say until very recently, it has still been, in a silo. But I think the new thing, and that goes for many countries, I think, is that now it starts to be much more integrated. And it's for sure that in Denmark, in the Nordics, in Europe, with the ambitious targets, the job aspect is really at the heart of the discussion. Of course, not the least in light of COVID-19. How can we combine these ambitious targets with the job creation? And that is why I think the trade unions, they are very much also into the picture here. In Denmark right now, we have a social democratic government, and the Prime Minister said in a famous speech some months ago, said, when I wake up in the morning, I'm social democrat before I'm red before I'm green. But I mean, the whole trick now is to find out, how do you combine these things? And that's why it's not just about politics. It's really about this tripartite way of having employers, employees, civil society, NGOs, and the policymakers somehow pulling things in the same direction. And that is a big exercise now, so that it can be taken away from just being a topic for environment ministers, now into finance ministers, tax ministers, prime ministers, foreign ministers, to make it high politics.
Thank you, Connie. Tom, and what are the main challenges that are still pending from your point of view? I mean, and sometimes when we read the social media, we feel that the mining industry is the worst industry in the world, even though after what you have said, and of course I've been working with the mining industry for the last almost 10 years, I know perfectly the great efforts that the industry has made in order to achieve new targets and to fulfill the new requirements, not just the ones that come out of the current legislation, but the ones that are globally accepted. From your point of view, is the story tells by social media true, or is partially true? It's a communicational issue, or we are still facing really big challenges in the future?
Joaquin, I think we're not good about telling our story. I think we could tell the story better. I think the mining industry's positive impacts, especially in developing countries, can be very significant and can transform a country if they're done well. I think part of the challenge is that we also, when we communicate that, we need to communicate about performance, and we still have some challenges on performance. And for example, we have a commitment and an aspiration on health and safety to zero harm. We haven't yet achieved that. We're doing well on the operational fatalities. They're getting much lower than they used to be. But we also need to think about longer term impacts on health, for example, through dust and diesel particulate. But notoriously, in 2019, we had a catastrophe in Brazil where the tailings collapse there. That kind of event simply is not good for the reputation of the industry, and that's why for the last 2 years we've devoted a lot of effort to seeing what to do to improve the management and reduce the risk of this kind of event happening again. And actually, there's an interesting point to touch on in the process that we used to do that, which is relevant to what Connie said. I really like the point she made about tripartite processes. And when we commissioned the tailings review after the Brumadinho event, we put together the United Nations investors, coalition of investors, and then the industry to conduct a tripartite review in terms of coming up with a global standard. And some people will say, from their country, this a lot of this standard we're already doing. But an important part of the process is actually going through the process and having people in the room and doing the cooking together, because then it's a lot harder. But once you come out at the other end, you've got something which is much more likely to be accepted on all sides and to be taken up. And I think that's a very relevant point for any kind of process, whether it's to deal with a tailings collapse or to deal with sustainability more generally, or how you. So I think the health and safety tailings is one challenge. I think there are two other challenges where we still have some distance to travel. One is social performance. As you know, the easier deposits have all been mined. We're getting into the more difficult deposits. Many of them are close to communities. So strong social performance management within companies and strong community engagement functions will be key to engaging with those communities and key to the social license to operate that Connie just referred to. And, we saw last year, again, how the CEO of Rio Tinto lost his job because of a social performance management issue in Australia. And I think there's broad recognition across our members that we need to do a better job about integrating that into the planning and decision making within companies. And then the final challenge remains climate change, although I said we've made a lot of progress. If just to give you some of the numbers, 8 of our overall emissions are scope 1 and 2. So 92 are scope 3. Scope 3 is the big challenge. We've cut 1 and 2 by 6% in the last 3 years, but that's a small portion of the overall challenge. So I think that will be taking up a lot of attention going forward, and there'll be pressure from all sides to show that we can deliver.
Thank you, Tom. Maybe a last. Oh, yes, of course, Connie.
Yeah, I just wanted to comment on that. I'm on Volkswagen's Sustainability Council. I probably won't have to explain why they, some years back, thought they should make such a body. But there we are really working with some of these problems. Also, for instance, electric vehicles, as you know, would use a substantial amount of raw materials, for instance, cobalt. So we have sort of initiated some pilot projects on how to do that in a better manner, how to extract in a better manner. And in line with what Tom just said about global standards, of course, that would be the perfect thing to learn from each other and then have applied global standards. But we all know that it's probably some time before we get global standards, because there are some who would be outliers and not wanting that. But I just wonder whether it should not be possible to have sort of a coalition of the willing, or some kind of cooperation between those who want to sort of initiate and make an impact on what in the future could become the global standard. So I think that there's something we could do better there. And it should also be possible in this modern world with digital means and big data and what have we, to faster learn from the best practices, to faster learn and be inspired from the best.
Thank you, Connie. Last question, because of the time. The conversation is very interesting, but you talk about a way to work on these issues, and the best way seems to be to gather companies, government, unions, NGOs, etc. From your point of view and from the European experience, which is the best way to gather all these different groups? Sometimes we believe and we feel we're too divided with different targets, and it seems very complicated to have that conversation in the terms that you can obtain some good results. I mean, who has to lead that? Is the specific industrial sector, the unions, the NGOs, or the government directly? It depends in a particular person who has the leadership to do that. Which are the best experiences in to obtain that? I think that is the right way to face these challenges, and the experience that you have in Denmark or in the northern country maybe be very helpful for our future.
Yeah, I think that our tradition is that sometimes things also come from bottom up. People are very engaged, citizens are very engaged, the members of the trade unions expect them to do something. There's a very, very well organized civil society, so sometimes it comes from there. But I think that basically you would need everyone to take responsibility. The policymakers have one part of the responsibility, but they cannot do it without, the big industries, without the cities and the communities, and without basically democracies having the support of their citizens. So I would say all of the above is needed. I often wonder, how come that big companies who have a lot of muscles by themselves, why are they sometimes just waiting to see what kind of regulation will come their way? Where policymakers can sit in a late nightly hour and come up with something. Why not a bit more proactively try to take this agenda and sort of come forward with what they want to do instead of hoping that this will just go away. It will not go away. And my final point, Joachim, is I think it's extremely important to remember to include citizens in this conversation. I think you alluded to it yourself earlier on, the polarization, what we see in some parts of the world now. It's really, really important, I believe, to be open and to have a broader discussion about where are we heading as societies. And I think that there, our democratic institutions and our politicians, they have a huge responsibility in trying maybe also to use modern technology to reach out and have a more deliberative democracy, a way of including citizens and the civil society in these kind of conversations. That will, in the long run, give the best results, and it will give the most steady and predictable course towards where we are heading.
Thank you, Connie. Tom, would you like to say something about that?
And everything, so I just have to comment a little bit on that, but we've seen a good example in the US of where big corporations have actually taken the initiative issues themselves without waiting for the politicians to regulate, because the politicians have been, absent at the table. And I think that, of course, that's out of self-interest, but it's because of pressure from investors reflecting, individuals' concerns. So I think there are examples of where companies are able to, forecast the direction of travel and to react without waiting for regulation. I think it is important that politicians keep up and critically in terms of climate change, that at the global level that we move together, because I mentioned carbon pricing earlier. Carbon pricing is only going to work if we can find a way of implementing that in across the globe in a way that doesn't create gaps where people can exploit big differences in price and sort of export their problems to elsewhere in the world.
All right. Well, the last question for you, Tom. We know that the ICMM is developing an interesting work for mining to count with low emission vehicles. This is very important for Chile because we are in a deep discussion about the green hydrogen, and it seems as it will be a new energy product that will solve some of our challenges in this field. What results do you expect from this work of the ICMM? The mining count with low emission vehicles.
Yeah, so actually the initiative has three objectives, Joaquin. So one is to reduce emissions and has a very specific objective of having emission-free vehicles available by 2040, which is a big challenge because these are very different kinds of vehicles to the ones you get on the road. But it also has two other objectives related to safety. One is collision avoidance technology by 2025, and also diesel particulate matter, which is carcinogenic, especially in confined spaces like underground mines. And the aim of the initiative is to sit down and collaborate with the value chain, rather like what Connie was just describing on the electric vehicles, and and to accelerate progress towards these targets and ultimately to beat the targets. And the objective is to first of all, we've already come up with a maturity framework so that people can assess where they stand compared to others, where they stand within their own company compared to other sites, and then to accelerate progress by enabling people to see, whether they're ahead or whether they're behind in terms of their peers and the rest of the operations in the company, and ultimately, hopefully, deliver on these deadlines and hopefully, ahead of the deadline.
Okay. Well, we thank Connie and Tom for the time and for this very interesting and a nice conversation. The insights that they have given us during this conversation, which will undoubtedly be relevant to the constitutional process that lies ahead in Chile, and of course, to tackle all the challenges that the environmental changes are putting on the table for the countries and of course for the mining sector. We also thank all of you for joining us at our annual seminar. Many greetings and good afternoon.